What's up guys, I'm Dave Klein, and welcome to my Elden Ring Lore series. Today we're going to discuss the runt of the litter, and someone who would dream for more. Today we'll discuss the lore of Godrick the Grafted. To begin, it's worth considering when exactly Godrick was actually born, and who he was born to. The one thing we know for certain, repeated over and over again, is that Godrick was a part of the Golden Lineage. His knight's armor is emblazoned with the two-headed war axe, an emblem of the Golden Lineage, and as Kenneth Haidt relays to us,
"And to think, he's the blood of Godfrey, last of the Golden Lineage."
So, the simple answer from Godrick's Great Rune is that the first demigods were the Elden Lord Godfrey and his offspring, the Golden Lineage. That includes Morgott and Mohg, which we know for certain thanks to Morgott's Great Rune. The Great Rune is the anchor rune that houses the base and proves two things: that the Omen King was born of the Golden Lineage, and that he was indeed the Lord of Leyndell. Godwyn, Godrick, Godfrey, and really, potentially countless more demigods and offspring. It's my personal opinion that even the various grafted scions we find are likely of the Golden Lineage, as the one found in the Chapel of Anticipation drops an ornamental straight sword, which tells us, after falling from grace, the dregs of the Golden Lineage sought power and purpose in the past. To me, that speaks to the grafted scions, as grafting is a very unique ability to Numen, although that does mean they could potentially be Numen unrelated to Godfrey. But the fact they all use ornamental straight swords, which specifically tells us dregs of the Golden Lineage sought power and purpose in the past, and as we'll discuss, I think grafting can be pretty strongly related to the past. I think the scions are distantly related to Godfrey and America. The grafted scions speak to a larger element of the Elden Ring story that is oftentimes glossed over from the in-game descriptions. At one point in time, far before the events of the game, there seemed to be many demigods roaming around. The wandering mausoleums of the game are where soulless demigods slumber, and we really don't know how many that entails. At some point in time, the Gloam-Eyed Queen was roaming around with her godslayers killing gods, and very likely demigods, meaning there had to be enough unnamed gods we're unaware of for her to become as big of a threat as she'd become. Although I do think a lot of elements surrounding her are pretty contradictory, and I already started writing a lore video around that. The real point I want to emphasize here is there are many demigods that we never hear of in the game. We have no idea how many of these demigods were getting freaky, with how many people, and how many children they'd have, and how many children those children would have. So, back to the original question, when was Godrick born, and to whom? And we really don't know. The most we can say is that Godrick was born before the first defense of Leyndell, and sometime after Marika and Godfrey started having offspring. I'm sorry that's an unsatisfying answer, but at the very least, I think we can pretty concretely say that Godrick was unlikely to have been a direct offspring of Godfrey and Marika. Because it isn't common knowledge that Morgott is of the Golden Lineage, and it's pretty unlikely Morgott was having children en masse, considering most of his life was chained underground, then acting as a veiled monarch, I think we can conclude that Godrick is either an offspring of Godwyn, or a distant offspring of Godwyn. Something important I touched on is the grafted scions, which of course relates to Godfrey's ability to graft, and this is something we actually discovered more about in the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC. While the main game refers to Marika and her kind as Numen, the Numen are said to have come from outside of the Lands Between, and are in fact of the same stock as Queen Marika herself. In times past, it seems they were known as Shaman. The Shaman village of the Hinterlands is heavily implied to be the birthplace of Queen Marika, and the shaman had a very unique ability that would catch the interest of the Hornsent living nearby. The flesh of shamans was said to meld harmoniously with others. The Hornsent had their own idea of what to do with this knowledge. But generally speaking, that means all shaman, and therefore Numen, have this ability to meld harmoniously with others, or graft. Although, even though they have this ability, it's not something we really see too much of, and I think that has to do a lot with the changing times and changing religious viewpoints of the denizens of the Lands Between. In earlier times, being able to meld together would have been seen as a very positive thing. It would have related to the Crucible, which was viewed as holy by some of the earlier citizens, like the Hornsent. From the fine Crucible Feather Talisman, Hornsent view the Crucible as sacred, or the refinement wrought through its evolutionary gifts, most prominently their tangled horns. And the crucible itself is kind of the entanglement of everything. In a way, it's like primordial soup. The crucible knot talisman, as an example, is a talisman fashioned from a bony knot that embodies the aspects of various creatures, a vestige of the crucible of primordial life. In fact, as grotesque as their ritual around shamans were, and that they stuffed them in jars to meld them together with whatever else they stuffed in the jar, they still view it in a somewhat gross but religiously positive way. For pity's sake, your place is in the jar, nigh sainthood itself awaits you within. But with Marika and the Golden Order came a new dogmatic system of beliefs. Even though Marika herself was a shaman/Numen, her religion was based around the Erd Tree, and pushed away the melding together of the Crucible. As the Crucible Knot Talisman further tells us, it's a vestige of the Crucible of primordial life. Born partially of devolution, it was considered a signifier of the divine in ancient times, but is now increasingly disdained as an impurity as civilization has advanced. So in this new modern viewpoint in religion, different elements merging together is bad. That's why Hornsent are now viewed as bad and disposable, Misbegotten are viewed as bad, Omen, with all their horns, are viewed as bad, and grafting then would have also probably have been viewed pretty negatively from many of the more dogmatic citizens. Take it from Nefeli Lu and her viewpoint on Godrick and his grafting.
How utterly repellent this is. This grafting of Godrick's ill befits a lord. He's tainted the very winds. If you intend to challenge Godrick, I ask you call upon me. The winds run foul with his deeds. I'm certain Father would permit me aid the fight.
To throw a wrinkle into all of this, and perhaps the reason Godrick and the Grafted Scions were okay with grafting themselves, we have to take a look at the Crucible Knights. From the Crucible armor, the Crucible Knights served Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, holds the power of the Crucible of Life, the primordial form of the Erd Tree. Early on, when Godfrey first started ruling and before Marika's religion and the Golden Order became increasingly more strict and dogmatic, the Crucible didn't seem to be viewed all that negatively. So much so that it seems some of Godfrey's best warriors were Crucible Knights, and the Crucible Knights' aspects of the Crucible allowed them to temporarily use the power of other beings. And when you think about it, that's a bit like a temporary grafting. So let's take a look again at the description from the Ornamental Straight Sword. After falling from grace, the dregs of the Golden Lineage sought power and purpose in the past. So while modern religious views of grafting are negative, the past certainly seemed open to it. I think that pretty well describes Godrick, Godfrey, and the Grafted Scions. Prior to the Shattering Wars, there was a pretty important event where various demigods inherited shards of the Elden Ring, and there's an interesting bit of dialogue from Melina/Marika at the capital outskirts I think is worth listening to.
In Marika's own words, hear me, demigods. My children, beloved, make of thyselves that which ye desire. Be it a lord, be it a god, but should ye fail to become aught at all, ye will be forsaken, amounting only to sacrifices.
While there's no way I'm aware of to know the exact timeline of this event, I think it's possible that this bit of dialogue was after the Elden Ring was shattered, and perhaps Marika was bestowing the various great runes to her demigod children. Honestly, I think this interpretation could be the most contentious of my interpretations in this video, so take that with a grain of salt. But it is interesting that Godrick, for some reason, has a great rune, even though he may be a distant descendant of Godwyn. So it does bring into question just how distant of a descendant he really is. While we're not explicitly told this, it seems Godrick was born with a twin, Godfrey. Twins are a common element to Elden Ring. Morgott and Mohg, Malenia and Miquella, the twin maiden husks, R'hllana and Rennala are potentially twins, and it seems Godrick and Godfrey. While we don't know much early on about these two, it seems to me that they were the primary drivers behind the first defense of Leyndell and the start of the Shattering Wars. We know from the Spirit of Kristoff that Kristoff was an honorable knight of Leyndell who was also a devout worshipper of the ancient dragons. His skills strike down foes with thunderbolts, the dragon's weapons of choice. After the first defense of Leyndell, Kristoff earned the Hero's Honor of Erdtree Burial for the feat of capturing Godfrey the Grafted. Meanwhile, Godfrey can be found in an Evergel on the Altus Plateau, just outside of Leyndell. And on the first defense of Leyndell, a sovereign alliance rots from within, traces yet remain of bloody conspiracy. To be clear, these two item descriptions are all we actually know for certain, and I'm about to make a pretty big inference. I believe that it was Godric and Godfrey who plotted the bloody conspiracy together, and they tried to take over Leyndell for their own to rule all the land. I also find it to be incredibly likely that this scene of war that is in the Elden Ring story trailer is a scene from the first defense of Leyndell. I say that because Godric's soldier armor has this distinct green and red pattern on it, depicting the Erd Tree and the Beast Regent. And in the story trailer, we see that very same outfit, and even Godric's soldier helmet, adorned by one of the soldiers attacking Leyndell. So it was during this war that Godfrey was captured, and Godric would end up escaping, likely by utilizing Marika's Mimic Veil. When Godric was hounded from Leyndell, the royal capital, this was one of a multitude of treasures he took with him, also known as Marika's Mischief. Marika's Mischief allows the user to appear as one of the inanimate objects found around them. And we know from Kenneth Haidt,
Honestly, Godric's nothing more than a jumped-up country bumpkin. Lord? Oh, don't make me laugh. First, he hid himself amongst the womenfolk to flee the capital, then hid from Radahn in that castle. Then he insulted Melania, lost to her in battle, only to lick her boots rather than die like a man. Has he no shame, the big girl's blouse? And to think, he's the blood of Godfrey, last of the golden lineage, though you almost wouldn't know it to look at him. Yeah, I almost feel sorry for the chap the more I think of it.
So perhaps that's exactly right. Perhaps Godric used the Mimic Veil to appear like one of the many women fleeing from the war. So Godric fled, and his forces took over Stormveil Castle, which is fitting, as for a time, Godfrey had taken over the castle from the Stormlord and claimed it as his own. Later on, Radahn would lose his own battle at Leyndell and travel to Caelid. So I have to assume that this is when Kenneth Haidt is referring to Godric hiding from Radahn. Then, later on, Melania would travel south to battle Radahn in order to try and force him into becoming Miquella's consort. I suppose Godric and Melania had some sort of exchange where he of course lost and begged for forgiveness, or perhaps offered to help her against Radahn. We really don't know the exact details. The most we really know comes from this sword lord. Godric the Golden humiliated, having tasted defeat by the blade of Miquella, now on his knees, begging for mercy. Either during these events or after, Godric bided his time attempting to grow more and more powerful, all while spreading his influence with his remaining army. The soldiers who serve Godric the Grafted are what remains of the army that fled the royal capital of the Erd Tree. Kenneth Haidt has a particular bone to pick with Godric, as Godric sent one of his knight commanders to take over Kenneth Haidt's fort. Godric also assigned Edgar to be the warden of Castle Morn, and seems to have attempted to take the Weeping Peninsula under his command. Of course, this doesn't really end up working out in the end.
There's a face I've not seen before. I'm Edgar, warden of this castle, as ordained by Lord Godric himself. But you can see how things have turned out. The menials have all rebelled. They gave me good service, or so I thought. But it seems it was all an act. Foul creatures, as it said, and true enough, they're foul inside and out. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but whatever you've come here to do, I'm afraid Castle Morn won't hold much longer.
We also see a small fort just outside of Stormveil Castle, where Godric has stationed his men to watch. I think something interesting about Godric's actions is that it seems to, in a lot of ways, mimic that of Godfrey. When Godfrey left Leyndell, he took over Stormveil, took Castle Morn, and seems to be the one who set up the Third Church of Marika just past the Mistwood and near Kenneth Haidt's fort, pretty much conquering the entire Weeping Peninsula and southwest of the lands between. That probably goes hand in hand with what we know of Godric's character. It seems that he was incredibly proud of his heritage and used it to try and gain power. The armor his soldiers wear is the Tree and Beast surcoat, which is armor worn by soldiers loyal to Godric the Grafted. The surcoat depicts the distant Erd Tree and the Beast Regent, an emblem of the Golden Lineage. Both are symbols of glory now past. That Beast Regent would likely be in reference to Siraj and therefore Godfrey. Meanwhile, the Godric's knight's war armor that's left breast is emblazoned with a two-headed war axe, an emblem of the golden lineage. The knights surely boasted of their strength in days long gone. That two-headed war axe could be in reference to Godric's very own great axe. Great axe wielded by Godrick the Grafted. The golden battle axe is emblazoned with the figure of a beast, representing the strength of Godfrey, first Elden Lord and patriarch of the golden lineage. Or, and I think more likely, could actually be in reference to Godfrey's axe, which was also a two-headed war axe. Weapon of Godfrey, Elden Lord. It was broken in battle, fought as leader of the Tarnished during the Long March. This weapon is symbolic of Godfrey's vow to conduct himself as a lord, later becoming an emblem of the golden lineage. In fact, it was probably due to this very weapon that Godrick chose to use a great axe himself. If Godrick defeats the Tarnished during phase 2 of his boss battle, he'll probably ask,
Great Godfrey, didst thou witness?
So, Godrick set up camp in Stormveil Castle, utilized his soldiers to reclaim the forts and castles that Godfrey had previously taken, and then began the process of trying to make himself more powerful through grafting.
What are you doing here in Stormveil Castle? This place is bristling with Tarnished hunters, you know. They sacrifice our kind for grafting. Not exactly a place I'd stroll into without a purpose in mind.
Godrick set up Tarnished hunters to, specifically, take and graft the Tarnished, or perhaps let his grafted scions take and graft them.
Everyone's been grafted. Everyone who came with me. They crossed the sea for me. They fought for me. Only to have their arms taken. Their legs taken. Even their heads taken. Taken and stuck to the spider. Did you know? If you're grafted by the spider, you become a chrysalid. It's quite the lark when you think about it.
That does bring us back to the Chapel of Anticipation, and an interesting thing to note. The Chapel of Anticipation is our first encounter with a grafted scion. We also find a grafted scion in Stormveil Castle, along with many, many corpses, including those of Roderica's compatriots. This leads me to believe that both grafted scions are working under Godrick as Tarnished hunters, and that one is set up at the Chapel of Anticipation specifically to ambush Tarnished who have just begun to be guided by the grace of gold. On the topic of grafting, it is worth asking when Godrick began grafting in the first place. While much is implied to show that Godrick specifically set up to become more powerful after booting into Limgrave and Stormveil Castle, we do have to remember that Godfrey is already grafted and is stuck in an Everjail, meaning he would have begun the grafting process before the first defensive Lane-Dell. That said, pulling back from lore mode for a second, it's possible that this was just a way for the team to reuse the boss asset of Godrick, and it's not something that should be thought of as deeply for the sake of lore. So while you could definitely use it as a clue that Godrick and Godfrey, or maybe just Godfrey, were grafting themselves prior to the first defensive Lane-Dell, I think it's still pretty possible this is something Godrick started doing after he'd reached Stormveil Castle in a desperate attempt to gain more power and retake the throne for his own.
So, Godrick the Grafted, Lord of Stormveil. Despite being the blood of Godfrey, first Elden Lord, he's a grotesque old fool grasping for power. His castle lies upon the cliff to Limgrave's northwest, but I suspect you know that well enough already.
When we find Godrick in the game, he's just obtained a new tool.
Challenge Godrick the Grafted, Lord of Stormveil, to acquire a great rune. Decrepit he may be, but a demigod he remains, and of course, an inheritor of a great rune. Worse yet, I hear old Godrick's acquired a ferocious new toy to graft. So, prepare for the worst.
That new toy is a dragon.
Mighty dragon, thou the true born heir. Lend me thy strength, O kindred. Deliver me unto greater heights.
Godrick holds high regard for the dragons.
Truest of dragons, lend me thy strength. Forefathers, one and all! Witness!
And this falls in line with what we know of the history of the dragons throughout the Land Between. The dragons went to war with Leyndell and were defeated at the hands of Godwyn, who then befriended one of them. Afterwards, an ancient dragon cult started in the city, and dragons were viewed a little more positively as some of their power stems from the same place. Not only that, but dragons were also at one point Elden Lords, although I don't think the people of Leyndell know that, hence some similarities in their powers and that of the Golden Order. So we know that Godrick is driven by power and a thirst to rule. He also seems to hold very little regard for those underneath him. While this is just one character, and Godrick does still command a very loyal army, it's worth noting what Gatekeeper Gestak feels about him.
What a pathetic excuse for a lord you were. Craven to the bone. Pushing me about like that, and after all that grafting, where did that get you? Look down on me, would ya? Godrick, you filthy slug. Feel it. Feel it. Feel my bloody wrath. This weasel was... Godrick was always looking down on me. He got what he bloody deserved thanks to you. I tell you though, what goes around comes around. He had an ugly heart, an uglier countenance, and met the ugliest of ends, eh?
Gestak isn't exactly great as he likes to loot corpses, so look, I think his opinion should be taken with a grain of salt. Kenneth Haight hates Godrick too, but that's really because Godrick forcibly took Kenneth Haight's fort from him. Meanwhile, Edgar seems to hold Godrick in high regard, and unlike some other soldiers we'll see in the game, Rykard, Godrick does still command a very loyal army. Godrick also holds little regard for the Tarnished.
Lowly Tarnished, thou art unfit even to graft.
It's notable that he mocks Tarnished for not being able to graft, as Tarnished are all related to Godfrey in that they're all of the same kin as Godfrey. So perhaps he doesn't realize the ability to graft really comes from Marika's side, but really that's just an interesting note.
Well... A lowly Tarnished. Playing as a lord. I command thee, kneel! I am the lord of all that is golden.
During the events of Elden Ring, Godrick is holed up in Stormveil Castle. He's tried to spread his influence and in some parts succeeded, and in other parts failed. He also seems desperate to return to his home of the Altus Plateau. His continuous grafting all seems driven by one purpose.
I am the lord of all that is golden. And one day, we'll return together to our home, bathed in rays of gold.
And that wraps up my first lore video on Godrick the Grafted. Let me know if you enjoyed. I know I'm very late on these lore videos, but in a way, I think it's actually nice to do these after Shadow of the Erdtree, as there are some holes in the lore that have been filled. Although I suppose we'll see if Night Rain ends up altering anything, as I wrote this pre-Night Rain. I was actually working for GameSpot back when Elden Ring came out and was making content for them, including some lore videos, but now that I've written a timeline video for them, and also thanks to other great lore tubers like Smotown and Vadi, I feel like I have a better overall grasp and can create better individual lore videos like this one. One more thing, I'm also slowly working on a game with a buddy. It's very, very alpha. The backgrounds are all placeholders, the tile set is just auto-laid out here, but if it looks at all interesting to you, I'd really appreciate if you followed our YouTube channel for updates on our company account at Ophidian Interactive. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.